Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're really delighted to be joined by Danielle Allen, professor at Harvard, one of the leading political theorists, students of democracy, of citizenship in the United States. Just has done some tremendous work. And she's also the director of the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. I could spend probably the full period giving you Danielle's background. It's just really remarkable. But let me just give you a few of the highlights. She was born in Tacoma Park, Maryland, grew up in Southern California, attended Princeton. From there, she won a Marshall Fellowship and went to Cambridge in the UK, studied at King's College, got a master's and doctorate there. Then she moved back to the US, went to the other Cambridge in Massachusetts, at Harvard, got a master's and doctorate there. Has had a stellar teaching career, including about a decade at the University of Chicago, and then also at Princeton and at Harvard. She's been real active in a number of task force and commissions. I mean, she's one of the real pillars. And she chaired a really important task force about a year or so ago on reinventing American democracy, working on citizenship issues, which is extremely important. She's a great writer. She's written columns in the Post and the Atlantic. And she's written a terrific and really powerful book called Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus, which we will talk about at some length. Danielle recently ran for governor of Massachusetts, ran a very interesting and inspiring campaign, withdrew recently, but I suspect she will be back on the campaign trail again. She received really rave plaudits for just an idealistic and yet practical campaign that just had a lot of uplift to it. So we're delighted that she joins us today from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Thank you so much, Professor Shaw, Dr. Shaw. It's great to be with you. Glad to be here.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about your early years. I mean, your dad was a professor, your mom a librarian. As I understand it, you grew up in a family with lots of books, a lot of interest in literature and reading. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, I definitely grew up in a family with books everywhere, and I am, a nerd fundamentally at heart. I was a little kid who used to love to sit on hot summer days. Underneath my bed, there was a wood floor below my bed. So that was a cool spot. And I would lie with just my head out from underneath the bed with my nose in the book. So that is definitely how I spent a lot of time as a kid, and really grateful for the love and support my parents gave me in opening my eyes to a big world through books and travel and other amazing opportunities.
And I read someplace where your family, maybe once or twice, actually read through the Bible as kind of literature. I guess that was the main focus. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
I mean, literature and faith. I mean, so I was raised in a religious family, and my father, in particular, my granddad was a Baptist preacher. And so my dad wanted to make sure his kids understood their faith traditions. And so we would after dinner every night, we would take turns, reading a chapter through sort of verse by verse around the table. And so we cycled through the whole Bible twice before my dad let us off the hook. So.
Well, then you went to Princeton, and you tell the story of this remarkable professor, Professor Ober, who was a classics. I think he taught you a class in Athenian democracy. Yeah. And you wrote of him, you said, "I'm in the field because of his teaching. I can't jump all over the room as he did, but I've realized how important his enthusiasm was to mine." Tell us about the professor.
Well, Professor Ober was extraordinary. I mean, he was enthusiastic. He's very tall. He's probably 6'4". And I remember when I was an undergraduate at Princeton, he had just arrived and he had come from Montana. And Princeton was a pretty buttoned down place. Most of the professors wore, something like yourself, jacket and tie and so forth. And he was there in hiking boots, and he looked like he'd just come from out west. And so he brought a certain kind of energy and dynamism into the space. And he was very supportive of students' questions and curiosities. He would always meet your question with a suggestion for how you could take it further and do more research on it. And so that was really inspiring and eye-opening.
And I read an article, I guess it was in the University of Chicago publication, about your approach to teaching. You say, "I don't usually think of myself as teaching knowledge. I like to think of myself as teaching a way to ask questions and advance conversations." Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was fortunate to start my teaching career at the University of Chicago, which is a really discussion-based university. And I sort of in my head sort of draw a contrast between lecture-based places like a Harvard or a Princeton, and then the Chicago, which is the sort of the seminar is the heart of everything. And at the end of the day, I am a teacher who feels most comfortable in that space where the job is to help students articulate their questions and then equip them to pull answers out of themselves and out of one another. And so the question is, where can we get together as a kind of collective thinking enterprise? It's not about my delivering, knowledge to you. It is about our thinking together.
Well, when you were in Chicago, you also had a venture that was, I think, really impactful for you and I'm sure for your students. Pardon me. And it was a program by the Illinois Humanities Council. I think it was called the Odyssey Project, in which you taught older students, many of them lower income. Was it the Declaration or some of our founding documents? Tell us about that experience.
Well, it was a humanities program generally. I mean, so we talked about my being from, I was a faculty brat, grew up with a professor dad and a librarian mom. I was also from a really big family, an extended family growing up in Southern California, and generally lower middle class in the 70s when we were growing up. But over time, 80s and 90s, as our economy really pulled into different directions, different parts of my family members ended up in different places. And some got really trapped in the worst things that we have in our society: incarceration, not getting through school, gun violence experiences, and things like that. And so, I could feel my own sort of family life sort of pulling apart. And even as I got more opportunities inside universities, I had a deep sense of care and commitment and connection to people who weren't getting the same opportunities as I was. And then one day I was sitting at a meeting with the woman who ran the Illinois Humanities Council, and she said, we've been trying to start this program in the humanities for low-income adults, and I can't find any university to partner with me. And I said, I've been waiting for years to have the chance to do something like that. So together we built a program, one-year program in the humanities for low-income adults. And the point was to try to help people who had fallen out of access to education get their foot back in the door for education. So we did literature and philosophy and history and art history. And yes, in that context, I really started teaching the Declaration of Independence a lot, as history, as philosophy, as an example of writing. So there, I've now had 20 years of working with the Declaration of Independence that really came out of that night class for low-income adults.
And you say that class also kind of reinforced the importance of just speaking clearly and directly and kind of setting aside the jargon and just speaking to people kind of where they're at. Talk about that if you would.
Yeah, I mean, the Declaration of Independence is this sort of hallowed text. It's so famous, and the original parchment is, underneath layers of glass and special gases that'll preserve it in the National Archives. It's sort of like it's almost untouchable. And as I began to teach the text in the night class to my students, I had this extraordinary experience where they reacted to it and connected to it so much faster than my, super sophisticated day students at the University of Chicago. And it was a really very basic reason why. The Declaration just tells a story of a bunch of people who were fed up with their circumstances. They'd had enough, sort of list of tyrannies from the king and the like, and they diagnose their circumstances when in the course of human events, they say, it becomes necessary to make a change, and then they justify their change, what they want to do. And all of my night students were in that class because they too were fed up with where they were in life. They wanted to make a change. So they got that kind of human core of the Declaration really fast, and it just opened it up for me, its power and its really, magnificence.
I was reading a profile of you in the Harvard magazine, and it was referring to you as kind of an analyst and also as a writer. And I want to read a few sentences and maybe have you first blush and then you can react to it. But it says, as a commentator, Allen stands out among progressive writers for her even-handedness and generosity towards conservatives. She has been unsparing about the candidacy of Donald Trump, though she will argue with rationality and great restraint with individual Trump supporters. But her columns otherwise contain little in the way of gripes, insults, or insinuations about Republicans destroying the country, in which some liberal op-ed writers traffic. Past columns on issues like government power and drug policy take pains to build a middle ground between left and right. Her writing reads like the product of a more civilized, less polarized time when American communities were sufficiently purple that people generally thought about how their words would make their neighbors or relatives feel before they spoke in public. Talk about that. I mean, maybe just your approach to analyzing public policy and also writing about it.
Well, I mean, it's a mixture of the personal and the intellectual. So at a personal level, for starters, I was raised by a very serious conservative. And so was myself raised as a conservative. My own political journey really got underway in college. I did start questioning some of the things I'd been, brought up with, and traveling abroad and so forth also brought me new perspectives. But as a result, I am from a family network of people that spans the ideological spectrum. And when I was a kid, my dad, who is conservative, and my aunt, who was running for office in the Peace and Freedom Party, very far left party in California, would have just these incredible arguments over the dining room table. So I grew up in a space where it was possible to disagree ideologically and never break the bonds of love. And so I carry that with me as a basic expectation for how we can be in the world. And then, there's the intellectual part of it. I mean, I think there's a great passage by George Washington, I think in the farewell address, where he basically says, when we see great polarization, what that actually means is that neither side has the answer. And so there's a job to do to figure out what is the little seed of truth that might be lodged inside this crazy, clouds of passion on both sides, but let's step back and not make a decision because it means we've got it wrong. And so we've got to actually reorient and find a new path towards the right solution. So, I take that quite seriously and think that it is helpful actually for finding the way toward better solutions.
Okay. Well, let's talk about your work on the coronavirus, because as I mentioned, this book is a really powerful guide to just tell us really where we are today, and talk a little bit about how you got so immersed in the kind of research. I know you were at the Safra Center, and COVID was breaking out in the early spring, and you wanted to see what you could do, and your research center just plunged into it, wrote a couple dozen white papers, policy frameworks. Talk about how you got pulled in so fully into the COVID crisis.
So there is a little bit of prehistory here. And the prehistory really, again, it comes from life and life experience. I lost a beloved cousin, Michael, in 2009. We had grown up together. He was probably the first baby I ever held. And in 1995, when he was 15 and I was a few years out of college, he was arrested on a first arrest in Southern California for an attempted carjacking. That was a terrible thing to have done, but it was also a time in California where punishment was at its most intense. And so on that first arrest, he got a sentence of 12 years and 8 months. And from 15 did ultimately serve about 12 of those years. And so in 2009, he was shot and killed by somebody he had met while he was in prison. And that was a very devastating moment for me. I had always been somebody who saw our country as having a mixture of light and dark, things to be proud of, lots of reasons for optimism, and also challenges and struggles. And in that moment, I came to have a sort of bleaker view of just the way in which, especially for some communities, we'd gotten to a place where people were really trapped. And as a result of that, started really working on justice reform questions. And I landed at Harvard at the Ethics Center in 2015, in the same year that the National Academies of Sciences had put out a report on the causes and consequences of mass incarceration. And this was an extraordinary report, big team of scholars. They just combed all the data, trying to, is it economics? Is it health questions? Is it education, demographic factors, and the like? And after they scrubbed all this data, there was this amazing chapter 12 where they said, but another really important cause of the rise of mass incarceration is that nobody has asked basic ethics questions for years about punishment. What is punishment for? What is justice? What should be the parameters of just punishment? We've been rinsing and repeating this sort of retributivist and deterrent framework. We haven't asked those basic ethical questions. And so I said to myself, coming into Directing Ethics Center, aha, that's our job. Our job is to make sure ethics is always at the table for every hard public question. And that led me to build a group, a network of scholars that we call the Justice, Health, and Democracy Initiative, that was trying to link scholars across disciplines, law and public health and medicine and political science and ethics, philosophy always at the table. So that group had been working for several years, Justice, Health, and Democracy, when COVID hit. And there you go. There was a problem where we had a huge intersection of health and law and political science and basic ethics questions. So we thought we could contribute. And yes, we jumped in. And right from the get-go, we did that work of seeing a polarized conversation. Some people saying we've got to protect health. Other people saying we've got to protect the economy. We said, no, don't start by assuming a trade-off, okay? You can't have a healthy economy without health for people, and you can't have healthy people without a healthy economy. There's got to be a way here for us to work on aligning our objectives of protecting lives, protecting livelihoods and protecting liberties. We can do those things at the same time. How do we achieve alignment? That was the question we asked, and all of our work flowed out of asking that question.
Well, the U.S. Obviously has not performed well, and I think there's a footnote in your book which you cite a study that came out just in the early days of COVID by the Imperial, I forget what it was called, college, which said something to the effect that if the United States did absolutely nothing, 2.2 million people would die. And I remember I actually saw that study when it came out, and I thought, oh my God, that is such a astonishing number. Yeah. And then I think of, 2.5 years later, after all that we've done and all the contortions and all the trillions, 1 million people died. And again, 1 million is less than 2 million, but still it's a scale of failure that is astonishing. And as you write in this book, I mean, it breaks down on so many levels, the trade-off between economics, seeming trade-off between economics and public health, the fracturing of our federalist system. But really, at core, you say it's a kind of unraveling of our democracy, or excuse me, our governance. And let me just read a sentence. You said, when the new coronavirus arrived in the United States in January 2020, it hit an economy, society, and constitutional democracy fundamentally unprepared. As the scale of challenge became clear, the country simply could not deliver what was needed to confront it. Talk about that.
Yeah. Early on, March 2020, as I said, we were trying to figure out how to align the objectives of protecting health and protecting the economy. And it became clear quickly that the answer to that question was a real ramp up of testing infrastructure and contact tracing and supported isolation, right? So if we could see the virus, if we could know where it was, you would be able to slow its spread much more effectively and really do that work of protecting health and the economy simultaneously. And as we were working on, laying out what kind of supply chain work would you need to get this done and so forth, one of my scientist colleagues said to me, Danielle, there's no law of physics that has to be broken to get this done. And that was a sort of very inspiring statement, right? This is scientifically possible. There's no law of physics that has to be broken to get this done. And the journey to try to get to a place where we actually had built out the testing infrastructure that we needed really taught me a deep lesson that there was a law of physics that had to be broken. It's called the issue of trust and distrust in politics. In order to do hard things together, members of a democratic citizenry need to trust each other. And we are riven by distrust. And at the end of the day, you can only convert distrust into trust with time. And so we had a time problem that we had to deal with. So that is a kind of law of physics that is captured in the form of politics. But so in other words, our rising polarization, our division over years is what our coronavirus response got caught in. And, it just sort of shows you how vulnerable our own fighting makes us. And it shows you, I think, how important it is for us at every level of our government to see what we can actually do to rebuild trust relationships, proving ourselves trustworthy to one another, recommitting to some kind of shared endeavor.
I want to underscore that point by just reading a few words that you wrote, which really hit me powerfully. It said, the pandemic taught us a dark truth. We don't know in conditions of emergency that we will be okay together. Too many people were willing to abandon our elders. Too many were equally willing to abandon essential workers. Too many people were willing to abandon the young. Too many people were also willing to abandon African American and Hispanic Latinx Americans. Too many were willing to abandon rural workers. Too many people were willing to limit liberties indefinitely or act on them abusively. Talk about that just erosion in what you call the social compact.
Yeah. It's a long list there of ways in which we let each other down. And so in some sense, different groups of people are letting other groups of people, down at different points in time. But the basic idea of a social compact or social contract, right, is that we all chip in, we pay our taxes, we work hard, we follow the law, and then we get back protection of our rights and some basic kind of foundation for our material well-being. And what was so astonishing to me, in the first weeks of the pandemic was how quickly some people just weren't getting that protection at all. And essential workers, right, who are being pushed back without access to testing and PPE. And so those who could, those who had resources, like were building bubbles. My university, colleges and universities were protecting themselves, and the MBA was protecting itself. And then others were just left to fend for themselves. And sometimes, it was just kind of, you could see it as kind of collective action failure. Every organization was just kind of tending to its own garden. And to some extent, you can understand that. But I was also just astonished by how often in casual conversation I would hear people say about older people things like, oh, well, it's just their time. Why are we doing all of this when it's, it's just their time? And, that kind of thing along all those different axes over and over again. It was very scary, ultimately, in terms of what it revealed about how far away our instincts are from the expectation that, we're in it together. This hard thing is hit and we're all in it together, and we've got everybody to protect right now.
And of course, during this whole crisis, there's been a discussion about just our functioning government and the federalist system we have with a federal government, state, local governments. And, there's been some writing about, okay, this shows federalism doesn't work. As you point out, other federal systems, Australia, Germany, did pretty darn well on this, or better than the United States. So you say it's not a flaw of the system itself, but a flaw in the governance of the system. And particularly, I think you're most critical of the federal government, just its inability to set a clear strategic direction, to give accurate, factual information, to just sort of kind of lay out how we are going to be okay together.
Yeah, that's sort of the basic job of teaching the public and engaging the public in both, just sort of routine understanding, development of understanding. That did not go well as led by the Trump White House. That was a real weak spot in our national response for sure. But with regard to federalism, I think it's important to say there's another really big issue. We have two competing pictures of how our federal structures are supposed to work. And I think they're both wrong. So on the one hand, on the right, you have the view that federalism just means let states do whatever they want. And on the other hand, on the left, you have the view that the whole point is to have a strong central government, strong, sort of national government. And I think both have sort of actually missed the point of what the original design was. We had the Constitutional Convention when the Articles of Confederation were breaking down, precisely because it wasn't working when states were doing everything that they wanted, right? The whole point is that causes breakdown. But by the same token, everybody, recognize that you need the right kinds of things centralized, but you don't need everything centralized. And so the vocabulary that they used in the Federalist Papers to talk about what the goal was harmonization. That the job of federalism was to make harmonization of interests between states and national interests possible. And so it's that project of harmonizing across jurisdictions that I think we don't really articulate for ourselves often any longer as a project. And that's really what I was wanting to make the case for, is that, we need the federal government to articulate a goal and then to think about how to bring those jurisdictions into a harmonized effort. Australia was a good example. Their national government set up an emergency council with representatives from every state's leadership from both parties in every state. So right from the get-go, they had a kind of nationwide council whose purpose was to harmonize effort across jurisdictions and, forgetting about party position.
Well, you also write powerfully about the role of schools during this crisis. And I have to say that this was the part that was most illuminating to me because, schools, obviously, with schools shutting down, we thought a lot about the education component. But you say schools have taken on a much larger role in American life than sometimes we appreciate. You say schools are delivering food, medical care, and sometimes even housing facilities, showers, and the like to children who would otherwise go without. When a school closed to in-person learning, the immediate need to be addressed was not a gap in student learning, but a more fundamental gap in student access to basic necessities. Schools have accidentally become our welfare infrastructure, something this pandemic has made apparent. Talk about that.
Yeah, for me, that was a real eye-opening moment. I have to thank my colleague, Mira Levinson at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for really calling attention to this fact. But yes, when schools shut down in March 2020, the worst crisis was not the educational crisis, but the crisis around basic needs. And so schools had to scramble and figure out, okay, how are they going to keep providing food anyway, make it available so families could come pick up food and the like? What about the sort of routine health visits that they'd been providing and so forth? And so what became visible was that, as we reduced and sort of unbuilt the welfare state in the 90s and 2000s, what has happened is that the sturdiest existing state level public infrastructure, which is schools, have picked up a lot of those functions. So I actually think this is an opportunity for us. I mean, if we can see that schools are providing this backbone and sort of foundation of support for communities, I think we could actually invest some of our efforts to provide that sort of safety net function sort of in schools and through schools, really see schools as anchors for healthy communities. So it was a kind of eye-opening moment, like an X-ray, being shown on our infrastructure, but I do think there's an opportunity in what we saw.
Another really important point you make is just sort of how maybe our lack of civic education sort of made us unprepared to understand what the roles of government could be or should be. And you use a number that has gotten, grabbed my attention. You say the United States now spends about $50 a year per student on STEM and only 5 cents a year on civic education. And then you say we have gotten what we paid for.
Yep. Well, enough said.
How important would be this is more a long-term strategy, but what should we be doing in the context of civic education and citizenship development?
Yeah. Well, I think it's so important when we talk about civic education that we sort of put the whole kit and caboodle on the table. So lots of times, you'll hear folks say, gosh, we've really got to teach kids to participate and really teach them to appreciate the institutions of democracy. But the truth of the matter is, you can't just encourage people to participate in something if it's broken. And we have lots of evidence for this from other parts of the world. So in places where democracies are still developing, lots of times you'll see a really energetic effort to encourage voter turnout and the like. And then the election will be as corrupt as ever. And so then the result is people are more cynical after you started than beforehand. So you can't just do civic education or encouragement to participate on its own. You actually also have to tackle the health of the institutions themselves and their governance capabilities. So we do need to reinvest in educating young people about our constitutional democracy and really building up their own civic muscles so that they know how to participate and can feel effective and powerful in participating. But we have to also take responsibility for ensuring that what we ask them to participate in is worth their time. And that's the point I really want to underscore. I think for a lot of people right now, our institutions don't feel honestly worth their time. They're not solving the most urgent problems in their lives, whether that's a housing crisis, whether that's issues of justice reform, whether that's issues around taxes or a sense of having the liberty to participate in your faith in the way that you need to. A lot of people feel that our institutions are not delivering for really pressing needs. And so, we do have to take a look at that piece of it at the same time that we're trying to pull people back into participation.
Well, in the book, you lay out your agenda, and I love the fact that you said, I'm not just going to tell you what's wrong. These are some of the things we can do to start getting ourselves back on track. And you list 5 initiatives. I want to touch on them briefly. One of them, you say smarter, more progressive taxes to pay for the public goods we need. Mm-hmm. Talk about that, if you would.
Sure. So, at the end of the day, to build a healthy society requires investing in core infrastructure. And we know that when we think about freeways, for example, or airports and things like that, there are other parts of our infrastructure that we need for a healthy economy. So the education infrastructure, health infrastructure, and the like. And we really are at a kind of pivotal moment in our country, a little bit like the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the US had a budget surplus. And we didn't give that budget surplus back in tax, paybacks or sort of, sales tax holidays and the like. What we actually did was take that surplus and invest it in the infrastructure of a free and prosperous Europe. We invested it in highway infrastructure, Eisenhower's infrastructure in this country. And the result of those investments were then economies and societies that were more prosperous and healthy on both sides of the ocean and strengthened the conditions for freedom generally. And we need those kinds of investments now. We have taken huge hits in this country from the global recession in 2008, from the pandemic, and we really do need to reinvest in the basic foundations needed to support healthy communities.
Well, another one you said, which I thought was very powerful, you say we need activists who organize for government and not just power, organize to build super majorities in support of common purpose, not 50+1 majorities to hammer the other side.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that people probably think that sounds crazy. The notion that people would organize to sort of secure supermajorities. But, when you look around at state politics and ballot propositions, it's not crazy. We actually have seen a number of states pass ballot propositions in recent years with supermajorities. And they range from, in Massachusetts, we had more than 70% vote in favor of ensuring that small auto shops can access the data in cars, and so that they can continue to stay in the business of doing car repairs. In Florida, a supermajority voted to restore voting rights to people who completed their felony convictions. In Mississippi, a supermajority voted in a new state flag to replace the former Confederate emblems on the flag. So it is actually possible to achieve supermajorities. And when you look at the places where we've done that in the country, it actually reveals a very powerful moral compass pointed at the direction of a fair and inclusive 21st century democracy. So I like to call out those examples to say to people, like, you can aim for a supermajority. You can pull people from the other side together with you for a work of shared purpose.
Well, Dr. Allen, in your writing, you talk a lot about social media. And in this array of responses, you say, we, the consumers of contempt-driven media, need to stop consuming contempt-driven media. Explain about how we get out of this morass.
Well, maybe I'll just give you one very specific example just from my own experience. I just came off running a gubernatorial campaign. And anybody who is currently exposed to the world of politics and political fundraising knows you get 1 million emails and text messages. And a ridiculous number of those emails are structured around trying to stir up the emotions of anger and fear and outrage. So people have figured out that those emotions make money, basically. It's just very straightforward. It's like a cash register, like make people angry, like get a buck, make people angry, get a buck. And so we are creating a kind of pathology for our whole society, like out of that fundraising mechanism. So in my campaign, we committed to the idea that we were only going to work in the emotional registers of hope and respect and possibility. And yes, we were going to have to fundraise, but we were going to make sure that we were always telling people the truth. Here's what the facts are, and here's what we think the cause for hope is in this context and condition. And we were successful. So it is possible to work in ways that are supportive of people's psychological life in positive ways that are not bringing negative emotions to the surface and the like. And I think we have to ask for that. We have to refuse to pay for things that make us angry and outraged and fearful. Just stop giving money, stop paying for anything that makes you feel that way. And if we can stop doing that, people will stop doing it, and we can find our way onto another path.
Well, you've mentioned your campaign, and it's in reading about it, it was really touted as idealistic and tough-minded and inspiring. And I wonder, as you were out on the trail, were people interested in, and I guess this is not either or, the issues of housing and transportation and education, the meat and potatoes issue, or were they interested in just the state of our democracy? What are people worried about in Massachusetts? What are they thinking about? What are they hoping for?
Well, it's definitely both and for sure. But I will say that I think, you don't exactly win votes just by invoking democracy, which is an interesting thing. So although people are very worried about the state of our democracy, for everybody, there's something in their own life that is also a really kind of immediately felt need. And again, maybe it is about housing, or maybe it's you've been stuck in a commute for ridiculous numbers of hours and you can't get home to see your kids before bedtime. And it's like life just isn't right for some reason. And so the challenge, I believe, is to make very clear how our failures to address those pain points flow from the weaknesses in our democracy, and to make those links for people. That's the really critical thing, I think, to driving change toward a healthy democracy.
Was there anything on the campaign trail that just really surprised you?
Oh, goodness. Well, I think the biggest surprise, honestly, was how much I enjoyed myself. So that was a surprise. I mean, honestly, when I started, it was really the pandemic that provoked me. I had a real sense of despair about the state of affairs and governance failures and how slow our own state government in Massachusetts was to see really critical needs for elderly people, for communities of color and the like. And so I had this sort of, grit my teeth to do this, like eat my vegetables kind of attitude, like somebody's got to do it kind of thing. And to the contrary, it was such a joy. I mean, meeting people all over the state of Massachusetts who are doing such good work in their communities, it became clear to me that all the solutions to our problems are right there, lying around on the ground, clear to people in local communities. And what we really need to do is to make space for people to be able to step up, share their good ideas, be empowered at the level of state government to actually bring them to fruition. So that's where I come back to the importance of voice and access and full participation for everybody as the solution to so many of our challenges.
Great. We have a couple questions that have been emailed in. The first is Mindy from Carbondale, who in full disclosure, is my wife, but she sent a question in. And she noted that in the New York Times today that the Senate is putting together a $10 billion COVID package, but it removed $5 billion as part of the global vaccine initiative. And she's wondering, is this penny wise, pound foolish? Is it in some way a metaphor for U.S. global leadership on COVID?
I do think it is penny wise and pound foolish. I mean, the more that we can do to slow the circulation of the virus, the better for all of us. And at the end of the day, it really is that global vaccine drive that is so critical. So yes, I mean, I think we've seen a real shift away from our ability to be kind of clear-eyed about how leadership on behalf of the globe generally brings benefit to us.
William from Carbondale asks, even before the COVID pandemic, vaccination as preventive practice has become polarized in the United States. What can we do to depolarize that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the things that I worked hard on in the schools and COVID work was really trying to encourage state governments to help schools set up school-based COVID response teams, basically, that were taking responsibility for that public health conversation with their communities. And at the end of the day, I got some uptake, but not, universal uptake for sure. And I think we really do still need to do the work of empowering people in local contexts with knowledge and expertise, and then with the tools to be carriers of important messages to their own communities. So we need to move away from sort of top-down messaging and really support empowering local leaders to engage with their communities around critical health questions.
Well, on COVID, you wrote your book. I think you wrote it in maybe March of 21, so about a year ago. A year has passed. What if you were to write a final chapter or an additional chapter? What is this last year? How would you assess what we have been able to do?
That's a great question. And so, yes, I mean, the book kind of was written in phases. The first draft was written May 2020. So it was really, really very early. And then I was sort of trying to revise it through 2021, basically. So it was a challenging book to write. Slowly, we have gotten better at having consistent educative messages coming from the CDC, and then reinforced by the White House and with sort of shared messaging between the two. And so I think slowly, we are getting to a place where, as a society, we have a shared understanding of the risks and the tools at our disposal to respond to the risks. So that's an improvement. It's painful to see how slowly it goes, trying to rebuild that capacity, but good to see that we are rebuilding it.
A final question. We have a lot of students joining us today, and I mean, you've done so many things, and this is going to be a sweeping and maybe a hard question to answer, but what have you learned in terms of your professional life? What are the central lessons that you've drawn that will, kind of instruct you going forward, and that you would maybe encourage students to think about as they consider their careers?
Well, I feel very grateful to have a strong sense of personal purpose. And so I am, for lots of reasons coming from family and life experience, really committed to the goal of achieving inclusive, participatory, healthy democracies, the kinds we deserve here in the 21st century. And I see healthy communities as flowing from our achievement of those inclusive participatory democracies. And so because of that strong sense of purpose, I'm able to see opportunities in my life as a scholar, my life as a teacher, my life outside the university, and to put them to work on behalf of that purpose. And so, lots of times I think it can feel like a rat race, what job should I have? Should I move from this job to that job? And I would just really encourage students to stop and try to figure out, what is it that really is driving you? What would you like to see come into the world on account of your efforts and energies? And then when you begin to have clarity about that, ask questions about jobs and roles in relationship to that purpose.
Final question. Do you have another book coming out? I mean, I know you will, but is there something else percolating? Are you just letting things simmer a little bit?
Well, slightly embarrassing. I have a book that'll be out next year. It's more of a tome in this case. It's a big book of political philosophy, sort of a capstone for a body of work I've been working on over a decade. So it's called Justice by Means of Democracy.
We will look for that.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to talk with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Allen. And thanks to all of you for joining another edition of our series, Understanding Our New World. We'll have a video of this conversation on our website tomorrow. Please look at it, show it to family and friends. And thanks for supporting the Institute, keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.